So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay on the test patch, and this is something which we haven't seen in quite some time actually, and that is a simple 1v1 on, I guess this isn't so much a grass, well I guess it is, it's more of a sort of arid grassy plain though, the sort of thing that you would expect to find in more arid climates perhaps, but yeah, this one was sent to me by Tommy and he's going to be facing off against Django today, and this in many ways is actually a purer example of the game's balance than many of the replays I end up showing, which tend to be set piece sieges of course, and that's kind of a narrow view of how powerful factions and units within the game can be of course, even though they do tend to make for the most interesting, certainly visually from a spectacle standpoint, battles. This perhaps is a better look at how things are progressing mechanically, at least between these two factions. And we're going to be seeing Dorwinion take on Mordor today. Mordor are very common of course to see in many of the battles that take place on my channel, purely because obviously Mordor being the titular villains really of Middle-earth are going to be often finding themselves on the attack, but they're going to have to change up their tactics at least a little bit in a situation like this where they have to face off against Dorwinion, and as I'm sure we will see, Dorwinion are kind of an interesting faction in the sense that you're always going to get rather the same kind of units, so you know what to expect, but they're also going to be difficult to deal with in many ways. We will go through the Dorwinion army first and foremost, Tommy sending me the battle replay, because of course there are no attackers or defenders when things are laid out as such, and he has got a ballista crewed by the Elven ballista crew with their two-handed spears, obviously quite lightly armoured and not necessarily the most numerous, so perhaps a good opportunity does exist for some factions to try and not only try and snipe artillery pieces out, but also maybe try and deal with them via lighter ranged attacks like arrows. But on this occasion the ballista is more going to be designed, I think, perhaps for sniping out some of the larger entities that Mordor have, but also in trying to force Mordor to move forwards. Dorwinion rarely in this sort of situation are going to want to try and tackle a Mordor army which is significantly bigger than themselves in charging across the plains like this, because they do stand a fairly high chance of getting enveloped, and especially when Mordor can back it up with some heavier units, it can be a daunting prospect as much as it is in a siege battle here on the open plains. But the ballista will make it more likely that Mordor will have to be the ones to take the initiative, but we'll see what they have brought in response. Elven Vanguard are going to be good at holding the line, and of course the anti-cavalry capabilities of spears are also going to be, generally speaking, a little bit more important out here on the open field. They're going to be able to cover the flanks a little bit more so. Mordor do have a few mounted units, some of which are actually very, very powerful, though not as numerous perhaps as other factions the game has to offer, but going to be marshalling the flank here, and individually speaking they have the defensive abilities to certainly be able to keep pace and outperform many of the basic Mordor units, but the higher tier Mordor forces are going to have a relatively easy time against the Elvelin, but more on them later. Nandor Glade Guard represent one of the Dorwinion units which can hide. Some of the Elven units and one of the human units in the Dorwinion roster can hide, and this is one of the things we do have to keep in mind when thinking about the Mordor player's perspective, is they can't see portions of the Dorwinion army, which means they're going to have to move forward, otherwise the ballista will do too much damage to them. But they're going to have to do so in a structured manner, otherwise Dorwinion will be able to find gaps in their advance, and especially with the high charge bonus that the Nandor Glade Guard have, they can do a lot of damage very quickly to even some of Mordor's girthier units. Just in behind we also have the Nandor Glade Riders, who are not hidden, but much the same sort of thing on horseback as it is on foot. Their main benefit really is their huge charge bonus, on par with many of the strongest cavalry units in the game, though of course in comparison to them the Nandor are much more fragile, both in terms of their armour, so their ability to tank ranged hits is significantly less, but also in melee, especially against some of Mordor's scarier units on their own mounts. It's going to be a little bit more difficult for the Glade Riders to keep pace there, but that's not their intended role anyway. We also have the Morroquendi Stalkers, which can hide on horseback, obviously a mounted archer unit. Elven arrows as well, capable of doing a good amount of damage. Harassment with horse archers may be a little bit easier to pull off on an open plain like this as well. And also poison projectiles, of course, which that morale debuff could hit Mordor pretty hard, especially if their leadership is dealt with. That's the sort of thing which can really make Mordor's mental strength start to tumble. And it's not just those units on horseback either, it's also the standard Morroquendi bows. They may not be the best at skirmishing back and forth with heavier archers, though I think they should outperform most of what Mordor have outside of bodyguard units that can fight at long range for Mordor. And of course the Morroquendi bows can't hide, but they still have access to those poison projectiles, so as the battle goes on, any that still remain. will still be very, very useful for that alone. A combination of the Elven infantry, of course, which are going to be a little bit better in sustained combat against the orcs, and indeed they should be pretty efficient once again against the regular orcs, perhaps even more so than the spears due to the lack of that spear malice, but backed up by the Morroquendi pikes as they are. This is a good front line. This is going to be a front line which Mordor will struggle to deal with in terms of quality head-on. Mordor will be hoping to run over their lines and try and get in and around them, because that will take away a lot of the advantages the Morroquendi pikes do offer, but this at the centre of the army is not too surprising. We also have the River Patrol just in behind. Basic javelins, I'm sure that we'll see some from Mordor as well, though the River Patrol do come with a shield now, so that does bolster their ranged defence a little bit, otherwise they are one of the first choices of targets for many an archer unit because of how easy they were to kill, but the shield will mitigate that somewhat. Javelins in support of that front line, however, will also be useful for thinning out the orc herd. And then we have the Morroquendi Glade Lords. This is going to be one of the best units of high-end cavalry that the game has to offer if you want a little bit more finesse out of your cavalry, certainly in terms of defensive values. There are many cavalry units, particularly from the human kingdoms actually, which can outperform their elven counterparts. But the Morroquendi Glade Lords do offer very, very good abilities in melee against other cavalry, and obviously, as with most high-tier cav like this, their charge is obviously going to be very, very high. I'm interested to see how the cavalry performs actually in a situation like this, because we are going to be seeing the new meta start to come into effect with these kind of battles now. More Morroquendi Stalkers, I imagine it's kind of the same sort of thing over here as well, with River Patrol backing up Morroquendi Pikes, now Velen Infantry, another unit of Morroquendi Bows, and then on the flank, the shock of the Nandor Glade Guard and Nandor Glade Riders. Mordor, meanwhile, at least on this side, are going to be in a denser formation, which is not too surprising, especially if they want to advance from a surer place. So we've got some Uruk archers on the front again. In terms of skirmishing, you could argue from a cost-effectiveness standpoint that the elves may not do quite so well against the Uruk archers, but this isn't a siege battle where you know for a fact that your archers are pretty much going to be able to utilise all their ammunition, and Mordor in that situation will be very happy to see the elves trade back and forth with the Uruk archers, but here they may not be able to. The battle is going to be shorter, sharper. The elves will certainly be able to overpower the Uruks at range, and as soon as they do that, the elves are free to then keep shooting at the other orc forces. Of course, the other thing to bear in mind is Mordor are probably going to advance fairly quickly, which means the archer duel may not last all that long, so it's not going to be a pure skirmish fight, and indeed it will come down to how the players can utilise their archers when things get a little bit messier. Mordor, however, with that ability to support their army, can still go after some of the softer targets in the Dorwinion lineup, especially some of the juicier elven targets that we've seen. Orc fodder intermingled with the Uruk halberds. This is certainly a more cheap and cheerful kind of front line in comparison to the Elvelyn and Morroquendi infantry and phalanx hybrid force, which is very, very common, of course. This is only the first wave of the Mordor forces, and indeed in terms of infantry, Mordor have actually gone maybe a little bit lighter than you would normally expect them to, with several units of orc fodder, orc javelins as well, to help mitigate a little bit of the cost that some of their higher tier units have. Obviously the javelins themselves also effective for the same reason that the River Patrol are: cheap and potentially good armor piercing damage coming from them. More orc fodder, and these drummers I think are just going to be here to keep all of these low tier units fighting for as long as they possibly can, and also the Temple Guard are here as well to try and zero in on high profile targets. The Morroquendi Glade Lords probably first and foremost in their mind, I would imagine. The armor piercing arrows they have deadly, but Mordor are placing a lot of their eggs into their Monstrous unit basket, I think. Orc fodder and Uruk halberds are here once again, but they've also got Temple Executioners in and amongst this force. But it's the Olag High, the Melkor's Abominations, and the Beasts of Gorgoroth that I'm looking at here. The Olag High can be incredibly difficult to deal with if you don't have really good counters, units able to do a lot of damage to them very quickly. Charging into them with cavalry may very well be the answer here, though. Of course, cavalry can skewer trolls if they get a clean charge, though you don't want to stay in melee with them for too long. But if they can be escorted perhaps by the Melkor's Abominations, which are much more of a dedicated anti-cavalry kind of unit in comparison to anything Dorwinion have, really. It's very expensive and there is only one of them, so mobility should still be in Dorwinion's favour, but if Django can use his Melkor's Abominations well, he can at least blunt their effectiveness and hope that his quality will be enough elsewhere. Beasts of Gorgoroth, we've seen them in this new patch as well. They are very different to how they used to be. They're now significantly more effective than they ever were. Similar sort of story with the Mumakil and any Monstrous unit. I think they've struck a really good balance now, and we'll see the beasts be able to also utilise their javelin attacks from horseback, and another very expensive unit of cavalry is the Temple Inquisitors, another sword-wielding cavalry, so more designed for hunting down enemy cav units, and it's good for Mordor that they brought this much anti-cavalry cavalry, given the fact that if Dorwinion are going to win, they're going to need to make really good use, I think, of their fast movers. The horse archers may be a bit of a game changer. It's all going to come down to whether Dorwinion can withstand the brute strength of stuff like the Olags and the Temple Executioners on the front line, I think, because if they can, the rest of the Mordor army is honestly not that strong, and a lot of the Dorwinion rank and file will easily be able to deal with Orc fodder. The pikes really blunt the effectiveness of those halberds. The troll drummers are just going to be here to keep them fighting for that little bit longer. Mordor are entirely reliant on their very high-end units, whereas Dorwinion, I think, have got a better balance of things. So we'll see which of these two approaches shall be more effective. So without further ado, let's get this show on the road. So let's see then, will the quality split from Mordor pay off with their high-end units managing to overcome the forces of Dorwinion, or will Dorwinion's more balanced approach and more organised, slightly more defensive setup here on the open field work to their advantage? And we're going to be seeing the cavalry move forward as well. Morroquendi Glade Lords thinking of coming forwards in the distance. The ballista, of course, is only truly going to be properly useful if Mordor don't rush, which, of course, forcing that rush is one of the main reasons why you'd want to bring such units on this particular occasion. Morroquendi bows firing in as well. Those poison arrows could be a real problem if the Mordor leadership is too far away from the rank and file. You can see here the Orc fodder moving forward. They may be spears, but in the slightly looser formation they're in and just how low tier they are, perhaps it was unsurprising the result of that charge, considering how deadly the Glade Riders are off the charge. They may very well be a little bit more flimsy, but there's a huge amount of damage done to the Orc fodder there, and it's not really the sort of losses that Mordor can afford to take too quickly. They do need the numbers around their quality on this side of the battlefield, but this is where I would assume Mordor are going to start to exact a pretty hefty toll on the Dorwinion positions here, as much as the Glade Guard and the Vine Guard do a pretty good job of offsetting one another in terms of their defensive and offensive properties. When you're talking about the Beasts of Gorgoroth and Olag High crashing through the lines, I don't know necessarily how resilient Dorwinion are going to be here. The Ballista has done the job of forcing Mordor into an advance, but I think that was always on the cards for Mordor here. I think if you're playing as an Orcish faction against a force like Dorwinion, you kind of know that Dorwinion are going to want to be a little bit more defensive, and it's probably in your best interest to try and swamp forward and be a little bit more aggressive. So it's going to be a case of trying to engender confusion and panic in Dorwinion here. They are stretched pretty thin across the entire battlefield after all. And Django's Mordor forces here will be hoping to take advantage of that. Concentration of force on this side of the battlefield. This will mean Dorwinion do need to move the position of this flank over here to try and be a little bit more proactive as well, try and crunch in to Mordor from the side, and this is where we'll see the axis of the battle start to shift, because I don't think Mordor are going to be able to withstand a sort of counter thrust from Dorwinion over here either, especially considering the Dorwinion knights are over on this side of the field, and the vast majority of the poison arrows are also going to be finding their way into the orcs on this side of the field. Morroquendi pikes will be an interesting unit to see in action here as well. You can see the Beasts of Gorgoroth doing their thing. Nandor Glade Riders charging in. I mean, off the charge they can do a fair amount of damage, but unlike the Trolls, the Beasts of Gorgoroth and all other Monstrous / Elephant class units are not going to be quite so easy to deal with charges like that, and the Glade Riders' slightly more flimsy nature also now proving to be a bit of a problem. The Ballista crew, the Elven Ballista crew, does have a long weapon, so all of these mounted units will be taking a little bit of bonus damage at their hands. The Vine Guard are also a problem there as well, but Temple Executioners and Olag High now getting in to the front line as well. That's going to be a real problem for these Nandor Glade Guard, who are bravely hacking away on the front line trying to do what they can. But how much damage are they realistically going to be able to do to the stronger units? They'll be able to do a decent amount of stuff like the Uruk Halberds, but already, I mean, we're at half speed here, so you have to remember the players who are doing this in real time probably trying to wrangle their armies in terms of micro a lot. So the Morroquendi pikes moving forward on the front line, and it's kind of falling as we expected so far. Those javelins, though, It's going to be about the little victories, I think, because it's pretty obvious that Mordor are going to win ultimately over there. It's pretty obvious that Mordor are going to sustain fairly heavy losses in the middle here before their elite units arrive, whether it be at the hands of the Dorwinion cavalry, infantry or archers. But it's about the little victories you can score, and the Orc Javelins are a really good example of that, because the more damage they can do to the Morroquendi pikes, the more advantageous that's going to be for Mordor later on. Stuff like the Temple Executioners can be held at arm's length by elven pikes like this. And here we can see the Melkor's Abominations as well. Dorwinion really do need to be fairly domineering in this middle engagement, because as the Mordor cavalry starts to arrive, so far it's been Mordor who have been able to sustain the pace a little bit better. The Dorwinion cavalry trying to make its way around. They will have the horse archers as well, of course, which is yet more poison projectiles as well. But the Glade Lords, unsurprisingly, the target of the Black Númenórean steel bows in the hands of these Temple Guardsmen. And they really do need to use those Glade Lords effectively. So far, the Mordor cavalry has been used very, very well. And it's been used very well, actually, in an aggressive sense on the infantry, even though it's mostly counter-cavalry, melee cavalry, with the Temple Inquisitors and the Melkor's Abominations being more designed to be dominant in cav-to-cav combat. But they've had the openings to go after the Dorwinion infantry, and so far so good for them. There is the slight problem here of the stakes being in the way. You could clear them out with the Beasts of Gorgoroth, but I highly doubt that Mordor really have the luxury of being able to pick and choose where their engagements are. Though so far, I do like the way that Mordor have started this battle more than Dorwinion. Dorwinion, let's not forget, have also lost their artillery pretty quickly, so they may have got what they wanted in terms of forcing Mordor to take the initiative, but that has actually worked out for Mordor in the long run, I think, and that's an expensive unit to lose with it not really doing a great deal. But this could all still swing around. That high quality core that Mordor have is going to be a tough nut to crack, but all the support around it is pretty flimsy, and that's where Dorwinion could perhaps score some big victories. I think Dorwinion do need to regroup themselves a little bit here, however. Some of their satellite units are starting to rout and flee. Not great for them, and River Patrol also being hounded by the Melkor's Abominations, still being far more effective than any of the Dorwinion cavalry at the moment, but we are perhaps starting to see some of the cavalry coming around, although easing off a little bit. Morroquendi Stalkers and or Glade Guard pulling out wide also. All of the Dorwinion cavalry kind of at all points around Mordor now, so slowly but surely we're starting to see Dorwinion gain a little bit more freedom on the battlefield with their cav. I mean, they're poking into the Orc fodder here, not the most important of units, but it's a sign that at least the Dorwinion are going to be starting to utilise their cavalry in that slightly more aggressive vein, but this is going to be a real problem. They need to try and kill off these Beasts of Gorgoroth, as difficult a task as that may be. I mean, it looks pretty grim for Dorwinion when you consider the situation at the moment. Yes, there's still skirmishing happening around the edges here, but Dorwinion are still getting forced back, and a large part of that is because of the weight of stuff like the Melkor's Abominations and, of course, the Beasts of Gorgoroth. Bloodied up as they may be, they show no signs of slowing for the moment. Alvalan infantry still trying to steady the ship alongside the Morroquendi pikes, who are still in decent health, actually. In spite of the fact they have been peppered by the Orc Javelins, they're still certainly in a position to be effective enough to give Dorwinion the anchor they need to start clawing their way back into this fight. And Blade Riders now also trying to get involved. Morroquendi Glade Lords, the Olag High are way in the backfield over here, quite far away from the rest of the Mordor ranks, trying to finish off what remains of some of the Dorwinion forces out on the flanks. And I mean, these Vineguard have actually stood firm for quite a while at this point, even though we are moving at half speed. In relative terms, it hasn't been that long, I suppose, but Olag High, Melkor's Abominations, Temple Executioners, it's a lot that's been thrown at them. That could be a big moment, though. The Mordor General exposed and skewered. Over here, was he a member of the Troll Drummer unit, perhaps? Interesting place to put him. The Troll Drummer's actually fairly far away from most of the Mordor units, maybe a little bit of organisational errors going on here from Mordor, but the fact that the General is gone and the Troll Drummers are pretty far away from the rest of their forces means Mordor are going to be a little bit more fragile in terms of morale as the battle continues a little bit more. Of course, Abominations still lurking menacingly, and also the Temple Inquisitors. It's been a little bit difficult to gauge how useful the river patrol have been, but they've not been on the field long enough to be as useful surely as the Orc javelins, which now make up a fairly high proportion of the Mordor forces in the middle. And this maybe is what you would be a little bit concerned about. All of these Dorwinion horse archers have taken up good positions and have been slowly but surely whittling down the ranks of Mordor. And as much as Mordor do still have a good number of units here in the middle in terms of their infantry corps, don't really have the quality. You can see the Nazgul are right in and amongst things as well. Isolated though, that is how you want to see the Nazgul if you're facing off against them. You want to see them separate from the legions that they usually embed themselves within. Beasts of Gorgoroth slowly getting cut down now as well. Interestingly enough, by the Elvelyn infantry, a unit with no bonuses against them. I think the Morroquendi bows do have a slight anti-cavalry bonus, mind you. Morroquendi stalkers still firing away. There's actually still a lot of Uruk archers. It's not really been a battle where the archers have been solely focusing on one another like it can be in more slow-paced sieges. I think one thing that I would be concerned about from a Dorwinion perspective is throughout the entire battle really these Melkor's abominations have been effective. The Beasts of Gorgoroth are now routing though. That is one thing that they have going for them now, but Mordor still with the forward momentum. Dorwinion still trying to whittle down Mordor, kite them backwards a little bit. It's kind of like a messy set up a sacrificial line of defence and hope that your archers and range support and cavalry can cut down enough of the enemy that eventually Mordor run out of steam. Of course, separating the wheat from the chaff is something which may lead Mordor's army collapsing pretty quickly, but Nandor Gladeguard, who spent a lot of time wheeling around to the outer edge here, were doing reasonably for a short amount of time, but once again the Melkor's abominations clattering into yet more of the Dorwinion warriors and doing a good job there, though being given a taste of their own medicine over here as well. The Nandor, or the Morroquendi Glade Lords I should say, getting a good charge into the Temple Guard, and of course with their effectiveness in melee you need to deal with them and trying to cut down their DPS is also not a bad idea. We're going back up to 1 speed given the very fraught nature of this fight now. It's certainly not a fight that's organised any longer. It's more just a case of who's managed to consolidate the stronger positions and who still has the freedom with their ranged units and the punch, or cavalry units I should say, to be able to affect these very disparate engagements. I mean, the Glade Lords should be better at doing that than the Melkor's abominations, generally speaking. We're also seeing examples here though. Olag High, heavy trolls like this, very good against pikes. Even the very best of pikes tend to have a deficiency of stats, and disrupting their formation is the way to go, and trolls do that very easy with how large they are. Morroquendi bows last samuraiing these Uruk halberds. They'll rout pretty much immediately. If they get one more volley, that might be enough. At the very least, they'll be too weak to beat those Morroquendi bows now, but again, a bit of a footnote of an engagement there. Elvelyn infantry out wide. Nazgul, who peeled themselves off the front line. Really is a rather strange battle, this one. Morroquendi Glade Lords bloodying the Olag High, but managing to stand firm there. Maybe with a friendly fire coming in from those javelins also. Melkor's abominations might have been lost on them for the first time in a while. They've been such an important cog in Mordor's advancing machine so far. The ballista crew's still very much alive. I mean, the ballistas themselves can't have used up all their ammunition, but going over there would just put them in the way of the Temple Executioners anyway, so they may as well be used as makeshift infantry. Just another pocket of Dorwinion resistance over here in ground that Mordor had claimed far earlier. I mean, this is going to be a charge into the Uruk halberds, which is bold. That's enough to cause them to become shaken. They need to get out of there quickly though, because they still don't want to tussle with the Melkor's abominations really. A few poison arrows also streaking through the sky. Another really good charge there though into the Temple Guard. So as the battle has gone on, Dorwinion's cavalry has started to come into its own. Nandor Glade Riders still doing their thing. These Morroquendi pikes are doing a better job than most would do at surviving the trolls for an extended period of time. Another good charge there from the Dorwinion cavalry. More mobility now being afforded to Dorwinion and going after some of these very numerous but very fragile units of javelins. And the Elvelyn infantry will move forward. They took a few volleys on the approach, but in melee it will be an easy enough task to mop these Orc javelins up. Important victories these for Dorwinion, because they needed to see a few more of them. good charge there going into the Nazgul. A few more though. Each swing of those swords is going to be lethal to most units, even if they are on horseback. Morkwendi Glade Lords with a little bit more of a heavy hitting charge, and well, more than half of the Nazgul fall there. That is the issue. Their hit points have been depleted from these cavalry charges and brushes with elven pikes. And as soon as you can do that one hefty charge, they are still infantry at the end of the day and separate from their support. That is how you can deal with the Nazgul. It's more difficult to do in the usual siege battles we see, but a sandwiching effect there in the Nazgul. But you can see there only one of them fell as a result of that, so still resilient enough to put up a fight there. Elven infantry now being faced with trying to bring down those 8 Olag High. I mean, over in the distance where the ballistae were, there is still the resistance being put up by these Elven Vanguard and Temple Executioners. Cavalry has definitely had its part to play over here as well, though we haven't seen it, because there's no way that Elven Vanguard would be able to defeat Temple Executioners 1-to-1. They still won't, but Temple Executioners a little too depleted perhaps to be the tour de force in the late game that Django was probably hoping for. Uruk Halberds scattered and disparate as well. The earlier loss of the general could yet prove to be very unfortunate for Mordor, as their lower tier units may yet run for the hills. They were always going to be dependent on their quality, but they don't want their elite units to be completely left out in the cold by all of the others, especially not when they still have javelins to be utilised. Obviously in a quick and frenetic battle like this, you're more rarely going to see units completely run their ammunition supplies dry. Or javelins still throwing as many projectiles as they are able, but their melee skills are severely lacking in comparison to Nandor Glade Guard. One Nazgul still remains. 8 Glade Lords, these are fine margins, very, very fine margins. There's still a good amount of Temple Inquisitors as well, at least a good amount relative to what's left on the field. I think it is going to come down to how effectively this cavalry can be used. 2 more Trolls fall. Again, these high value targets continue to get rocked. Elven infantry. Still trying to do the same thing here, actually interrupting the charge with 1 stray banner carrier. Elven infantry may not be too numerous now, but their presence on the field is still required, otherwise it's only Dorwinion cavalry Mordor can form up a strong point, and the cavalry can be exposed to the damage of the Trolls if you can play it that way. But with Dorwinion infantry still on the field, it's not quite so simple for Mordor to do that. They cannot afford to turn their backs on units as damaging as the Nandor Glade Guard after all. Still, Temple Inquisitors and Temple Executioners, there's a big quality spike on the way, and the only thing in the way of them really are these very few ballista crewmen, and not for much longer getting bulldozed by what remains of the Inquisitors. Only 4 now though, so you can see this is very much a dance between the 2 cavalry units really. Dorwinion have got a few more in terms of cavalry, but Mordor have got more quality on foot. Still the small matter of that 1 Nazgul, which is by far and away the single greatest warrior on the field. I mean, if I were a betting man, you would probably go in favour of Mordor just because of the quality of some of their individual units, but the numbers favour Dorwinion. Still a bit of damage. I mean, there's still 4 Morkwendi pikes, which at this late stage, oof, that Nazgul. The charge didn't really land. It can be pretty difficult to land a charge on a single unit model when things are getting this bunched. And one thing you would say is, well, what's that? There's another, is that a Temple Guard over there? Yeah, 3 Temple Guard. That's still a pretty important thing to have late on as well. Even if it just comes down to them trying to kill off what remains of Dorwinion in melee, that could be enough. Mordor leaning on their high quality units as they were always going to. Can those Glade Lords do enough? Because it's going to come down to whether or not their charges can connect with enough ferocity. Dorwinion infantry is resilient enough to be able to withstand a little bit more punishment, but they are going to need the backing of their knights and the Vintner Lord riding with them. There's still quite a ways in this battle to go, which is interesting. one Temple Inquisitor, trying to finally finish the Mordor cavalry, which early on was having more success than the Dorwinion cav, but it may yet be the case that the Vintners are able to claim victory in that particular theatre of war. One Olakai remains. I have to say, I'm impressed with the Elvelyn class of units today, really living up to their billing of being very resilient. How much damage they've done, we'll have to wait and see the endgame splash screen, but they really have held their own against units stronger than they. The extra stamina and the finely crafted armour, worth every penny, but oh dear. I mean, 4 Temple Executioners and Nazgul. There's really only 1 Ballista Crewman and 2 Elvelyn infantry left. The General. Part of the problem here is each swing of the swords from the Nazgul and the Black Numenorians of Durthang are going to be very, very lethal, even to the Glade Lords, especially given the exertions of the battle so far. And it's not even as if the Elvelyn infantry, you could send them in, but they're just going to get butchered as well, so you need to deal with the Temple Guard first, though it's true, because if you allow them to continue firing their armour-piercing arrows at you, eventually they're going to get a fortuitous hit if you allow them to do as they will. It is very much, ooh, and there goes one of them, taking too long about it there, dancing around the issue, so to speak, literally and figuratively, but now it's going to be a case of whether you can cycle charge with your general enough. I mean, the general is the most resilient unit you have on the field, especially when you put them in a unit that's already multiple HP. That's going to be it surely for the Elvelyn infantry, but is that going to be enough? Because if it was just one of these units that were remaining, maybe that would be enough, but as I've already mentioned, all 3 of these in melee have got the damage necessary. Let's see then. Vintner Lord, drunkenly riding his horse around the field. I mean, the absolute carnage that remains. It also means what you can always tell when a battle is this close. You know that any sort of routed unit would have had a significant impact, both for Dorwinion and for Mordor. And both of them did have an impact on them as the battle took its course. Not a kill, not yet. And he has to leave. I mean, this is the thing, it's going to come down to fortune, really, for when one of those Mordor blades connects with the Dorwinion general, but the problem for Dorwinion is, of course, they still have those, and again, point blank hit. The longer they leave it, the more likely it is that one of those is going to hit him as well. His banner carrier that was with him previously caught an unfortunate arrow. Still, this is one of the few instances where I'm okay with this sort of hit and run style tactic, because both players I think have played reasonably well. It was a very chaotic battle. It's very difficult to maintain control of things when you're in this sort of situation. And now it's just a case of, obviously there is an art to using cavalry, but for the most part there is an element of fortune here. It's whether or not one of those melee attacks connects, or whether or not one of those armour-piercing arrows connects as well. I mean, slowly but surely have been chipping away at the temple units. I don't know if you're going to be able to do that to the Nazgul. The web, the jaws closing. Is that Nazgul going to swing his sword? No, although one blow was landed there. A little jab by one of the executioners. It does all add up over time. The chances of the next one being a killing blow are increased with each successful hit landed. There's another one of the Temple Guard. Well, the weakest of the melee combatants, but still the most dangerous, really. There's one archer still, and again another hit. Getting into the final 1,000 frames now. Is that enough time, considering the pace at which the Vintner Lord has been acquiring kills? Is that enough for him to be able to kill off all 5 of the remaining Mordor forces? I think that one Nazgul makes me think no. One swing of the Nazgul sword and the extreme stats the Nazgul have. Ooh, 2 of them. 2 for the price of 1. Maybe I spoke too soon. That is what he would have been looking for. Oof. really it's just a case of trying to maintain the safety of that one Temple Guardsman. Oh, that shot went wide and killed. So now it is one Executioner, one Nazgul. We know that the cavalry charges are going to hit, though. It's just whether or not they can avoid the sting of the Morgul blade. You can see them dancing around one another as well. I mean, the Mordor player knowing to try and avoid the full brunt of that charge, because it's been so lethal so far. Oof, that may have been a miss from the Nazgul. Is this going to be it? I mean, this, one way or another, I think based on the frames, we can infer probably what's going to happen here. Yeah. The counter-attack, 2 Mordor unit models remain, 1 Nazgul, 1 Temple Executioner, everyone else slain or fled. It's been a while since we've done a 1v1, and that's probably one of the better 1v1s that we've shown, the first of its kind that we've seen in the new patch as well, so big thank you to Tommy for sending this one in, big thank you to Django as well for being his opponent. And when it's that close, I mean really, literally anything could have made the difference, like one extra kill, maybe ordering a unit to go 1 second later or 1 second earlier, well I say 1 second, but like a moment earlier or a moment later can affect the outcome of a battle like that. It is what it is. I mean, one observation I did make early on was the fact that Mordor's cavalry was used aggressively, perhaps more effectively than Dorwinion's, and as the battle went on that did change, because the amount of Dorwinion cavalry on the field was always going to mean that was going to be the case to some extent or another. But still, Mordor being allowed to use their cavalry to that extent may have been a bit of a problem. Dorwinion wanting to spread out and really use the width of the battlefield, but the concentration of force from Mordor was good on one flank. Dorwinion did react properly to that, but it was always going to be quite difficult when Mordor build up ahead of steam, especially with Beasts of Gorgoroth and Olag High, with this amount of room to work with. It can be a little bit daunting to try and stop them, which Dorwinion did, and like I said, with only 2 units left, you can't really argue with the results there, but yeah, fine margins, the finest of margins. It could only have been closer if 1 extra of those Mordor units had died. But yeah, Morroquendi Glade Lords, as the battle went on, they were obviously extremely important. They were the thing which kept Dorwinion in it. They did very, very well for themselves. They nearly clawed back a victory from what looked to be a defeat, but and ultimately was, but still a fine effort indeed. Differing fortunes for the Morroquendi bows. Obviously the poison projectiles are one thing which would have helped Dorwinion, and had Dorwinion gone on to win this battle, you could say that the routing caused by the poison would have been one of the main reasons why. It wasn't quite enough in the end, but it was definitely one of the building blocks that Dorwinion used to prevent being completely overwhelmed. You could tell from after the Mordor general died, you did start to see a little bit of splintering from Mordor. Then Elvelyn infantry, the River Patrol were a bit of a waste. I mean, they were obviously feasted upon by the Melkor's Abominations and Temple Inquisitors. That's one very noticeable unit, which if even one of those units had maybe made an extra volley, that could have made the difference. Blade Guard did well. I mean, they're a pretty fragile unit in the grand scheme of things, but the damage they can do is obviously very, very high, especially against lowly orcs like this, and they did a good job. The Elvelyn, obviously we mentioned how resilient they were. The Ballista didn't really get many shots. I think they got 1 or 2 at the very beginning, but the vast majority of those kills, interestingly enough, would have been in melee, so Ballista crews are being made more effective in this new patch in melee terms, and elves, even though they're very lightly armoured, they can still do a job for you there. But Tommy will have been disappointed that the Ballista didn't get a few more shots off, but like I said, I think the main point of the Ballista in the long run, or the main thinking behind the Ballista, was to force Mordor into some sort of forward attack very early, but I think Mordor were always going to do that anyway. So yeah, there's many different things that could have tilted the battle ever so slightly into Dorwinion's favour, but ultimately when a battle ends like this, you can't really complain too much. You know, everyone wins in a situation like this, I think. But yeah, big thank you to Tommy for sending this one in, a nice little midweek bonus, this one. Eventually, hopefully, I will get back to doing 2 videos a week, just generally, but based on the situation, as I've mentioned over the course of the past couple of months, it's not really possible for the time being, but we do still see the occasional little extra like this, and maybe it's the sort of thing that can be continued a little bit more as well, because that was enjoyable. That it makes a nice change from the general set pieces that we usually have. Speaking of which, I don't actually know what the next battle is, but I think there has been a sort of mini update while I've been away. So I have 3 replays, this being the last of them, the previous 2 sieges and this one, where I had to remain on a slightly older version. Now I can fully update once again, and we can get back to doing the most up-to-date content. And there is one thing which I've noticed on the Discord, which hopefully I can show off in the coming days and weeks. A new map of a settlement which hasn't officially been in the game at any point, but has been referenced a few times. But we'll see. Hopefully it will be run and run well enough for the developers to want me to show it. But again, we'll see. It's all by the by, really. But yeah, big thank you to Tommy once again. Big thank you to Django. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.